When other people tell their history, they come across as being patriotic. When other people talk about where they came from and who they are and what their history is, that's called patriotism. But when African Americans do it, or when black people do it, they're labeled as being militant. They're called rebels. They're called Afrocentric. So that's the big difference. Our history, for some reason, it becomes offensive to people. So we have to stop being afraid to tell what our true history is.
The studies will show that the dominant population here in America especially, and in Europe, have wanted to claim everything for themselves. And so they have made up a lot of stories as they travel to places. And as we know, all of the places that the so-called European or the white explorers traveled, when they got there, black people were already there. Some kind of black people, or yellow people, or red people, or brown people. You as a black man are the root of all of the civilizations. Every body they've ever found, every tomb they've ever raided, whatever it was, they found something symbolic of the black man, either our features, your nose, your mouth, your head, the way we looked, our hair, even braids, everything.
The makeup of a human being's self-esteem, self-image, and self-concept is not only based upon one's family history, but it's also based upon one's racial history. So when you look at the self-esteem of black people and black children, you can rest assured that at least 50% of how high or how low it is contingent upon positive information that they know or don't know about who they have been in racial history.
And over the last, I would say, 1,000 years, there has been a protracted effort and an ongoing effort by those in power, the European powers especially, to make sure that what we have done as an indigenous, or what we call autochthonous peoples, Earth's autochthonous peoples, is erased irrevocably from the minds of all our people.
Only a people who haven't learned how to respect themselves will let someone suggest themselves that they forget about their history.
If you know yourself, there's no way that anybody could ever do the things to you, or would you do the things to you and yours that we find ourselves doing. So that, and in many ways, I don't really think it's hidden. It's there. It's just that they're not allowing us to understand.
According to Dr. Ben, the original name of Africa was Alkebulan. Africa, the whole continent, was also called Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic Ocean was called the Ethiopian Sea. So there were several different names. Africa was really described by different tribes. It wasn't a whole monolithic society, but eventually they named Africa after a European.
Africa was not called Africa. It's actually named after the one who actually conquered the Carthaginian Scipio Africanus. So they usually, the Roman types of system is that the conquering general gets to name the region he conquered. He gets his name to be placed on that region. So Scipio Africanus is they named a certain terrain after him. So everybody just said, well, let's call it Africa or Africanus. But if you look to Dr. Ben's work, you'll find that it was called Kush, and you'll find it was called Alkebulan. It had many names: Ethiopia, which Ethiop, which is essentially Greek. But the whole continent was once known as Ethiopia.
It's terrible, about just where math came from. All of the pictures that they've shown out of Africa, they've never really educated the Americans, white or black, about what really goes on in Africa, what some of the cities are really like. And that we're not running around over there with Tarzan, and when they show anything from Africa, even down to today, they pick the worst scenes, the most terrible situations, and they show those. But we have a proud history, but of course, what we did in Egypt 5,000 years ago, or what we did in China 35,000 years ago, is of no benefit if we don't understand what to do today and how that would help us to survive. We discovered the clock. We did discover the wheel. Black man has never been a caveman. You've never been in a cave. There's no history of it. You've ever been in a cave. We discovered mathematics and the alphabet and writing and all of those great things that they have built a foundation on, that they came and got and took back to other countries. We don't know what Africa would be like without the white influence. We don't know what it would be like without the Rockefellers and De Beers and all of them. We don't know what Africa would have been like. We do know that there were greater places in Africa other than Egypt, which is the only one they let us know about.
Concurrently and simultaneously during the Pyramid Age, there are great things happening in West Africa, but we very seldom. There are nations known as Dartichet. Dartichet is now, would geographically presently be located where Ghana is. We had the Nak culture, which is where we today would call Nigeria. We have the Monomotapan Empire in what today we call Zimbabwe. There are over 300 stone structures in southern Africa. And then you have that great structure in the great Zimbabwe that shows a direct relationship to the Grand Lodge of Luxor in Egypt. You have Puanit, which is in today's Somalia, Ethiopia. You have the Kush empires that are simultaneously happening. When Hatshepsut, the great Pharaoh king, although she was a woman, she was a Pharaoh king, sitting on the throne of Kemet, her cousin sits on the throne of Puanit, or what we call Somalia. There are great things happening historically across the African continent. You have the kingdoms of Kuba and Luba in Central Africa.
Mansa Musa was the king of Mali in the 1300s, very wealthy brother. During the dark age of Europe was going through a dark age, Africa was thriving. It was the gold capital. Mansa Musa was considered the wealthiest man on the planet at the time. Mansa Musa had a very well-known pilgrimage to Mecca, where he went to Egypt and went to Mecca and went through Egypt, and he gave out so much gold, it threw off the Egyptian economy. In today's terms, Mansa Musa gave away what would be the equivalent of $100 million in gold.
The African was the first race to circumnavigate the entire globe.
All over Africa, all over the world, the peoples of color that they call Africans, Alkebulanans, we were all over the world. So to say that in Ghana they had the Ashanti, they had, all over, we had powerful dynasties, so innumerable we couldn't even name them. Because remember, we had hundreds of thousands of years, and that's the secret. They cut us off at 6,000 because anything beyond that they could say is mystery. They could say is myth. So when you control the information, which is essentially what they've learned to do, under the Vatican they have about 6 to 8 miles of storage space that have all of our artifacts, and the Virgin Mother being black, all of the faces. We have to take apart the layers that are actually constructed in the lie. They're layered. For instance, you have a discipline in academia called Egyptology. Now, what is Egyptology? They say, well, it's the study of Egypt. Well, no, it's not the study of Egypt. Egyptology was created by the Vatican in order to make sure that there was a screening mechanism in place to explain away the truth that was being excavated every year, that kept giving them proof of who the ancient Kemites were. So Egyptology and Egyptologists are essentially agents of this information. Where else do you see a society, a people, and a way of life actually become a science? Unless you have specific purposes to make sure that the information that you are gathering on those people are given the proper perspectives to maintain the lie. So you don't get an Americology, you don't get Europology, you don't get Russiaology.
Richard Pryor, right? When he had his special back in 1977, there's a scene. They only allowed him to do 5 shows. In fact, they were rather ignorant because it took them 5 shows to realize what the brother was really doing. Richard Pryor, there's a scene where he goes in to the pyramids, and he is carrying the bags of the archaeologists and the anthropologists who are of European descent. And they're talking amongst themselves about what this find is and its importance, the greatness of it. And Richard Pryor is in this temple looking all around, and he begins to say, but all these people are black. He said, look at that guy over there. That guy look like my uncle. And he's just, I mean, it's humorous, but what Richard Pryor is actually talking about is that, these are black people in these pyramids, and these are the people that built these pyramids. He's saying, wait a minute, these people... And then all of a sudden, the camera begins to show the anthropologists of European descent, and they start to nudge each other because they realize, hey, the guy carrying the bags is looking around and he's learning some things in here. So very quietly, you see them backing out of the pyramid, right? And Richard Pryor is still there talking about how great the pyramid is, and then all of a sudden, they show you the door close, and all of a sudden the scene goes black. Which means that was the blackout on the information for black folk to understand their history. This is what Richard Pryor was dropping on us in 1977. This is what actually has happened. Richard was telling us, this is what has happened to us. Because as you become conscious, and brother becomes conscious, and as a community we become conscious, the Europeans who know this are beginning to realize. So they're trying to shut the door on us.
African people established the first dynasties in Asia. When you look at old paintings of Eastern Asian people, you can see the African ancestry in their features.
The Japanese were formed when Ethiopians brought South Koreans onto the island and combined with the original people there known as the Ainu. The Ainu now, you're going to find the Ainu in the Philippines. They're going to be called Negritos. You're going to find them in Vietnam. They're called the Champa or the Montagnards. You're going to find African people throughout the Far East. Very dark complexion, very curly hair, wide nose, thick lip. You will also find those with straight hair. You will find those with a more aquiline nose.
Some of the first Buddha statues clearly had African features, classical African features. If you go to Thailand, if you go to Korea, if you go to Vietnam, you will see some of these statues up that has the classical African nose, classical African lips, woolly hair.
When we go to Asia, we see that the founder of the samurai warrior, in Japan, was an African. We found that the founders of the ninja system was an African. In fact, in Japan, there's a saying that if you don't have a little bit of African blood, you can never truly be a samurai.
Martial arts was established by a black Dravidian who was living in southern India by the name of Bodhidharma. The Bodhidharma, it was said that he walked from southern India into Asia, China, and on his way there, he would study the fighting mechanisms of animals, and he used that as a form of self-defense for himself, and that's where martial arts started. There was another guy named Tigwai who was an original master of martial arts, and if you look at old paintings of Tigwai, this dude looks like Lionel Richie. So martial arts was really established in Africa. Even during slavery in Brazil, there's a form of Brazilian martial arts, which is African martial arts called capoeira. And what they would do, the African slaves would practice this form of martial art, and they would disguise it as dancing.
When we look at the early pictures of most of the deities of Asia, nearly all of them bore striking resemblance to the deities of the Nile Valley civilizations. And even in their writings, you will see that even in Asia, not just Greece and Rome, but even in Asia, you see them paying tribute to the spiritual systems and history that they had learned in Africa. In fact, the Asian spiritual system is probably the closest approximate to the traditional African spiritual system. From the one, you get many, with the creator being manifested in all living organisms, be it a tree or a human being. That is fundamental to Asian thought, but it's also fundamental to African thought, which predated Asia.
When you go into these jungles in Bangkok, in the areas of Vietnam, when the Vietnamese, when they were fighting in Vietnam, they went into these temples, they saw nothing but these African faces. When they saw the black man dressed up like that, they thought that the Buddha gods had come back. All these black men dressed in these American faces, they were accustomed in the bush to these black faces, these black Buddhas. And when you go deeper into that information, you're only seeing black faces. You could go down into certain parts of Africa or down there, I forgot the name of the tribes, but in the Bantu, you could look at them and they have very high cheeks and their eyes are completely slanted. So you can tell where the Chinese people actually ascended from.
it's just been awful how they've did us in religion. And our people tend to think that even those who feel that they know that white Americans have mistreated us, their grandchildren or great-grandchildren still mistreating us in a lot of ways, they still believe, well, but nobody would lie about God, when that's not true. People who are trying to subjugate another people and turn them into slaves, not just physically, but mentally, then they certainly would try to teach them that God looks like me.
A lot of people say it doesn't matter what Jesus looked like, it doesn't matter what God looked like or other deity. But the thing is, if it did not matter what Jesus looked like, why don't they show what the original paintings and pictures of Jesus look like? Why don't they show what the original paintings and pictures of the disciples look like? Because that's very important to know if it doesn't matter.
Michelangelo was told by the Pope to put the picture of the Holy Family on the roof of the chapel. Michelangelo said and the Pope specifically told him to make it European. Michelangelo explained to him that there are no models of a European Holy Family. And so he said, you'll think of something, and he did. He used his family.
We thought the only God we had was the one that white people gave us, which was Jesus, okay? And he looked like them. And when we saw them, psychologically, we would transfer that was deity. If it really was unimportant what he looked like, then why didn't he look like some of the majority of the people on earth? Why would he look like the people who are the minority race on the entire earth? We're not the minority.
People always ask me, why do the black church not get rid of the white Jesus and put a blue black Jesus in place with a nappy head? Because black people would stop going.
And not only did they hide the color of religious figures throughout Europe, they would hide the colors of other very important people, especially royalty in Europe. A lot of old paintings in Europe, they clearly show African-looking deities. They show the Black Madonna and Child. This is all throughout Europe. They show black pictures of Jesus. They show African-looking disciples all over Europe.
I mean, everything that you're looking at in the Roman Catholic Church today is the exact copy of what they got from Egypt. The high priest, the regular priests, you got the cardinals, you got the bishops, and then you got the Pope at top. So you had the Pharaoh, you had the high priest, you had the priests, and so you have the same type of categorization of people as they're placed in the temple, but their purposes and what they were telling was different.
When racism rose, because racism was a system, and prior to the system of racism evolving as a necessary instrument for the maintenance and protection of the European genotype, Europeans, for many intents and purposes, I would say just about worshiped African people.
First 3 popes were black.
You had one named Saint Victor, you had one named Saint Gelasius, you had one pope named Saint Matthiades. There was another brother named Saint Benedict, who was a patron saint in Europe, well known throughout Italy.
Militatus was a black pope. Militatus was the pope during the Council of Nicaea.
And we've had these brothers who were worshipped throughout Europe and Italy, and we don't talk about it in America, but they're well known in Europe. You have one brother, Saint Maurice, who's a well-known martyr and a religious figure throughout Europe, and you see his statues all over the place.
Many of those who early on helped to formulate what is modern day Christianity in Greece and Rome were also African.
When you look at Christianity, you're dealing with the Amen priesthood that's coming directly out of ancient Kemet. You're dealing with the rites and rituals of Osiris, the passions of Osiris, the idea of the resurrection of the dead and his son coming forward, Heru, as his living testament to his life. Aset, who the Greeks call Isis, is the essence of who Mary is. Nebetet, who is her sister, is who Mary Magdalene is. So that when you look at Christianity, I mean, even when you look at the word Chris or Charast, you're dealing with Chares. Cha means spirit and res means to rise. The Romans learned the Passion of Osiris through the Greek. And the Greeks learned it through the Kemites or the Africans from Egypt. So that it was just a retelling of the same story, superimposing things that they thought they knew. And that becomes what we today call Christianity. Judaism, that is Atanism. That comes directly out of the river Hapi or Nile. And that is why Moses himself was said to be initiated into the priesthood of ancient Egypt.
In fact, today, if you were to go to Africa and talk to the children who've been Christianized, they will tell you that their ancestors covenanted with devils, and this is why black people are in the condition they are today. So turn to Christianity, and of course you turn to the oppressor's religion, and then you eat the gruel that they give you, and at the bottom it says Jesus saved you. Of course, you're conditioning that person for another 1,000 years.
The falsehood of Christianity has taken a toll on black relationships, because really when women are taught, or women and men, but when you're taught as a female that God and Jesus is white, you're going to look at whites as somewhat of a savior figure, and you're going to look at the men in your life a little differently.
Try to just work on that more. We need to stop going to church every Sunday trying to get along with them and try to get along with the people at home. Some people leave home mad, but they go to church and go in there, and then they love the pastor and they love Jesus because there's no accountability. Jesus ain't gonna say, pull your dress down, come in off the street, go clean up the house. You know, Jesus ain't gonna tell them that. And if he do, they ain't gonna listen to that.
There is only one race on the planet, and that is the human race. And because of biological climatology, this race was born, nurtured, sustained, civilized, educated in Africa. And Dr. Clark teaches us that after they got their show together, then they took it on the road.
The origin of the name Europe comes from a Phoenician goddess named Europa. So the origin of the name Europe has an African origin, because the Phoenicians, we're still dealing with black African people, the Canaanites and all that. When we talk about Phoenicians, we're still talking about black folks.
The first Europeans were a group of Africans called the Grimaldi, who had migrated from Africa to Europe between 40 and 60,000 years ago. And in the process of evolution, many of them lost the Africoid genotype and phenotypical features, and then went on to look more European-esque. You even see in pre-racist Europe, Africans and Europeans living side by side. In fact, a lot of European families have an African background that they don't like to acknowledge.
Queen Charlotte, she was a woman of African descent, and this is well known throughout Europe. There was another guy, King Charles. Many people say that he has an African origin as well, that he has African ancestry. King Charles was referred to as the black boy growing up because he was so dark. And they have pubs over in Europe now called the Black Boy Pub or the Black Boy Inn, which refers to King Charles. There's also knowledge about King Charles being a descendant of the de' Medici family. The de' Medici family out of Europe, out of Italy, they're known to have that African bloodline as well. One of the de' Medicis, Alessandro de' Medici, who was a ruler in Italy, you look at pictures of him, this dude looks like Ryan Leslie. So you could see that African bloodline running through a lot of these people of royal descent. There were blacks in Scotland. There was one black Scottish king named Kenneth the Dub. There are figurines and carvings of black Scots.
The Celtic Druids was the African priesthood that had gone into Europe and had inhabited the islands of what we today call Ireland, inhabited what we today call so-called Great Britain, Scotland, and Wales. It inhabited Holland, inhabited Denmark, was all up in there.
Many Greeks and Romans were biracial, to use a modern term, which they didn't use back then. They were biracial. Their look, okay, could not readily on the surface be absolutely identified as European or black, because many of them was of a biracial stock.
Hannibal Barca, the great military genius, he comes from an African background. In a lot of movies and on television shows, they will try to Europeanize and whiten up the image of Hannibal Barca, but he was definitely a man of African descent. There are even coins throughout Europe and North Africa of Hannibal showing him. Many historians say that there's a coin of a black man and there's an elephant on the other side, and people say that that is Hannibal.
Yes, Hannibal Barcas was one of the greatest warriors that ever lived. And what he did, what he accomplished, is now still a matter of study in all of the world's military colleges. What he did by bringing together, he had the power to bring different factions together. He had different the Celts. He had the African horsemen. He had different types of armies. So when he went against Rome, they didn't know who to fight because there were so many different styles of warfare. And when you had such a genius and a brilliant man at 22, actually orchestrating after his father, of course, taught him everything that he knew, brought him on campaigns to teach him. He came back and actually took his father's genius to the next level. Septimus Severus was African, and he was the one that actually took the fight, took the Roman fight up north into England.
The Russian language that we know today can be attributed to a black man named Alexander Pushkin. He created the modern Russian language because they were speaking French and other types of language there.
Had it not been for someone like Alexander Pushkin, Russians would be speaking French today.
A lot of people say that people like Leonardo da Vinci and Sir Isaac Newton, they created a lot of inventions in Europe, but a lot of their inventions can be attributed to the African presence that was in Europe because there was a strong African presence and they were bringing in science and mathematics, so that's where all that came from.
Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, all of them studied with African people. They didn't come up with this. And when people talk about Leonardo da Vinci, the only question that I have as it relates to Leonardo da Vinci is who was his teacher? Who taught Leonardo da Vinci brain anatomy? Who taught him about the airplane? Who taught him this? Tell me who was his teacher. They can't tell you who the teacher is because if they told you who the teacher is, they would have to tell you they were black.
Marco Polo, he was considered to be one of the first Europeans to make it over into Eastern Asia. And what Marco Polo did, he took something known as the Silk Road into Asia. And the Silk Road was already established by Africans and other Aboriginal people. And the Silk Road, they would travel this road and they would trade garments. And this is why Italy has always been known to be a fashion mecca. People always talk about the quality of Italian clothes, but when we talk about Italian fashion, where did they get that fashion sense from? See, the Italians got that fashion sense from the Moors and the Africans that went in there. They brought those silk garments and all those fly clothes into Europe. Even the concept of alligator shoes, which is attributed to Italy. The thing is, alligators are not indigenous to Italy. Crocodiles are not indigenous to Italy. So where did they get those alligator skins and those crocodile skins? They got those from Africa. The Moors brought that in. And the players wear shoes called Maori Gators. Those are some of the most popular shoes around among players, the Maori Gators. The word Maori is a variation of the word Moorish. So we have to know all this stuff. All that is our stuff. That's African stuff.
If you look at art tends to follow a certain type of a zeitgeist, a certain type of a mindset. People tend not to just wake up and paint one picture in America that looks identical to a picture that was painted in Africa thousands of years ago. Okay, and so whenever you see a piece of art, you can best believe that it was inspired by something that was seen prior to. In fact, when you look at some of the great European artists, okay, Van Gogh and all of these types of guys, you will see a lot of their art was inspired by the so-called dark art of West Africa. There has been studies that have put the pieces of Van Gogh and others up next to pieces of traditional African cultural art in West Africa. That art that would be considered a negative, underworldly, dark and demonic. But the great European artists copied what was considered by Europe some of the lowest and most primitive forms of artwork that went on to be considered some of the most successful by them.
Another very important African figure in Europe was a black man by the name of Angelo Solomon. He was a guy, he was a Moor, he was a celebrity in Europe, in Austria. He was also known as the father of pure Masonic thought because he was a Mason as well. And this guy, when he died, they literally stuffed his body. They skinned him and stuffed his body, and they would have him on display at certain places. So he was a very important figure in Europe.
Suleiman taught Mozart. Who's Suleiman? Suleiman's a Moor. He's an African. Who is Beethoven? Beethoven was Thoven Bey. He was a Moor.
His mother was a Moor.
Really?
Yes. And when he went deaf, that melanin kicked in. The inner eye kicked in. He heard music that better when he was deaf than he heard it otherwise. There's also another myth that he cut the webbing of his hand down to the bone so that he can get a better stretch. So there's some of the 32nd chords that he has, he plays, and most people can't play. They need like two people playing. That's why some people, in certain instances, you see two people playing Beethoven, two pianos playing Beethoven. That's because of what he did when he stretched his finger.
Beethoven was called a Moor when he was growing up. Beethoven, there's a book about him called Beethoven's Hair, because people were so infatuated with the texture of his hair. So that African bloodline runs real deep throughout Europe. And again, he was called a Moor, and the Moors were very important throughout Europe. And it's funny, the importance of the Moor was so deep in Europe, but we rarely hear about them in history books today.
You see reference to Moors throughout African history. You see reference to Moors over here in American history.
The Moors were African men who went into Europe around 711 AD, and they really civilized Europe, because Europe was going through a dark age. Europe was really struggling because after the Vandals had basically destroyed Rome, everything was backwards over there. So the Moors went in and they ushered in the Renaissance era. They brought in science, mathematics, astrology. They brought all of this into Europe.
They are bringing in hot and cold running water. They are bringing in concepts of what we call a cosmopolitan city. They are lighting the streets by lamps. In Cordova, you know, they built an entire city where the streets for miles you could walk with lamps that lit the street at night. And they had raised sidewalks where people could walk. The kings and queens of Europe lived in barns. Nobody wants to admit that. But they lived in barns. They lived with the animals. And another thing that the Africans brought in was that they said, you know, you cannot let your chicken run around in your house, and them cows got to go outside. So they created what's called corrals. And corral is an Ethiopian word. It's a K-R-A-L sound. Corral, which is where they would put their animals after they domesticated them. Europeans let them animals run all up and down. This is where the German measles come from. This is where chickenpox come from. Because Europeans did not have a place for their animals. They just ran all up inside their places. And they would carry, as they would get illnesses and sicknesses, they did not bathe, so therefore they had no soap, they had no disinfectant, didn't have alcohol, so that this type of style of living brought illness. When the Moors came in, they wrapped all that up, along with bringing medicine. What you have happening is that these Gothic